Hi, and welcome back to 10-Minute Bible. 10-Minute Bible is meant to be a series of short videos in which we, in a meaningful way, I think, take a look at the Bible. And in this particular time, we are looking at a series. We have a series on Luke's version of Jesus' life. This is number 10. So again, welcome, and thanks so much for being part of it. Now, in the last video, we ended with Jesus making some very remarkable, maybe even astounding implications about his identity, about who he was, and leaving it hanging just a little bit so that people could do some figuring out and in that way learn who Jesus was as they thought about him and heard him and watched him as the days and months unfolded. So that's kind of a little bit of the context. Another part of the context is that Jesus is in a particular time of his own journey. He has gone public. He's traveling to different towns and villages and to the countrysides of the Jewish people in Israel, the same Israel that you see on the map today. And so here we have him approaching a certain situation. I'll read a few lines and then make a few comments, and we'll proceed in that way. This is the end of chapter 5, the last bit of chapter 5 in Luke's version of Jesus' life. After this, Jesus went out and saw a man named Levi at his work collecting taxes. Jesus said, "Come along with me." And Levi did, walked away from everything, and went with him. Few things here. Levi is a Jewish name, so we have this Jewish tax collector. Now, tax collectors in those days were considered, well, if there are tax collectors today, they generally have a pretty decent reputation depending on where you are or what your experience is with tax departments. But in those days, among the Jewish people, tax collectors were considered very crooked. They were collaborators with the occupying Roman forces, and they collected taxes for the Romans. They collected taxes from the Jewish people, who were frequently not well off at all. So Levi is not considered a very good person with his community by any means. And here Jesus says, "Come along and follow me." And Levi does. Walks away from everything we read. So he walked away from his livelihood, from his employee, his colleagues, the other people employed in tax collecting. We'll meet some of his friends in a few minutes. And walks away from his way of life and begins to follow Jesus. This is quite remarkable, but it's not totally out of place in that time and in that context. During those times and in those days, Jesus was considered a reputable teacher, a rabbi, and for a rabbi to invite you to become part of his entourage, one of his apprentices, was considered quite an honor. So there is that. And I also wonder if Levi, being a Jewish man aware of how his own community despised him, maybe wondering if his own way of life was not what it should be. He was also ready for a change and ready for God to offer him a change in life. And so these kinds of things maybe help us understand a bit what's going on here. Levi gave a large dinner at his home for Jesus. Everybody was there. Taxmen and other disreputable guests at the dinner. The Pharisees and their religion scholars came to his disciples, to Jesus' disciples, greatly offended. And they said, "What is Jesus doing, eating and drinking with crooks and sinners?" Well, this also is an interesting paragraph, because Levi seems to be doing his best to honor Jesus. He's throwing a dinner party for Jesus, and all of Levi's friends are there. Disreputable characters, Luke describes them, and Pharisees, that is some of the other more conservative Jewish religious leaders, and religious scholars are there, and they're offended, and they approach the disciples of Jesus and say, "What's Jesus doing? Does he realize that he's having dinner with crooks and disreputable people?" And they're called crooks and sinners. Now, I've already mentioned why Levi was considered to be crooked, but sinners, a number of people who look into these kinds of things feel that the word sinner is a polite way, a euphemism, a polite way of referring to prostitutes. So it is interesting that we see Jesus rubbing shoulders with people who are considered the lowest of the low, on the social ladder in this Jewish village. Well, Jesus hears about this, and he speaks up. He says, "Who needs a doctor, the healthy or the sick? I'm here inviting outsiders, not insiders. An invitation to a changed life, changed inside and out." So Jesus' reply makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, he's saying, it's the people who are sin sick, so to speak, who need a doctor, God's healing, God's renewal. And he says, I'm inviting these people to have their lives changed from the inside out. And he says, I'm inviting the outsiders. There's lots of people who are busy dealing with the insiders, the Pharisees, the religion scholars, and there's lots available for the Jewish insiders already, the people who have their lives together, so to speak. But for the people who don't have their lives together, those are the ones who God has a special eye out for. It's not that God, has something against insiders, but throughout the Bible, and especially in the life of Jesus, we discover that God has a special knack for reaching out to people who are on the outsides, out there on the margins, people whose lives have been very negatively impacted by illness, physical disabilities, and by sin. So Jesus says, I am here to reach out to outsiders. I think that's great. I'm going to keep going. So Jesus has answered that question. Then they ask also, Jesus, John's disciples. Now these are the disciples of John the Baptist, and some of my earlier videos I've talked about John the Baptist. John's disciples are well known for keeping fasts and saying prayers, and also the Pharisees, the very serious-minded, conservative Jewish religious teachers. But Jesus, you spend most of your time at parties. Why? So, John's disciples refrain from eating food as a way of praying and disciplining themselves, and they spend a lot of time in prayer. But you and your disciples don't seem to have that kind of lifestyle. You are spending a lot of time enjoying yourselves at parties. What's going on here? And so then again, Jesus, as he often does, answers with a little story, a little illustration. And he says, look, when I'm kind of reading, he says, when you're celebrating a wedding, you don't skimp on the cake and the wine. You feast. And later, you may need to pull in your belt, but this isn't the time. As long as the bride and groom are with you, you have a good time, and when the groom is gone, well, then the more serious work, the fasting, can begin. No one throws cold water on a friendly bonfire. This is God's kingdom, and it's here, and it's time to celebrate. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but I'm kind of drawing out from the text there. So, that makes a lot of sense. Jesus is out there. He's visiting the people. He's revealing to the people that God is present among them. He's healing a lot of people. It's fantastic. Jesus' teachings are very clear, and they're well understood, and they give a lot of people a great insight into, how they should be living. Frequently, we discover that the people are saying that, wow, Jesus teaches with power, with authority, in a way that our typical Jewish leaders haven't been doing. And so it's definitely a good time. And, here we have this Levi, this tax collector who was living a broken life, and he's changed his life around. He's turned it around, and he's even inviting God, so to speak, because Jesus is God, although people don't really know that much just yet. But he's inviting Jesus into his home. So all these great things are going on, and it's not a time for fasting and depriving yourself of all kinds of things, but it's time for feasting and enjoying. I've got a book called The Kingdom of God is a Party, and I think that title kind of gets at what Jesus is saying here. By the way, I think both of these things, the partying and the rejoicing, as well as the hard work, the praying, the sacrificing, and things that people do for God and to do God's good, both of these things, they're kind of like two poles, so to speak, and it's part of the life of God's people, both the serious stuff and the great times. And if you are part of a church and you hang around with God's people regularly, you already know this. And if you aren't part of a church community, that's one great reason to be part of it. It's to experience the life of God's people with other people, and there are the serious times, but there also are the great times. So, and then the very last few lines of chapter 5, Jesus says, "No one cuts up a fine silk scarf to patch old work clothes. You want fabrics that match, and you don't put wine in old cracked bottles. You get strong, clean bottles for your fresh vintage wine. And no one who's ever tasted fine aged wine prefers the unaged wine." Again, one of these illustrations where Jesus is teaching some things which are not hard to get a hold of, but what Jesus is saying is that he's up to some new things for God. And some of the old ways, the old Jewish ways of doing things, of God's people doing things, aren't going to work anymore. It's time for a big change. So that's one thing he's saying, and that you don't put, some of the translations, old or new wine into old wineskins, because the old wineskins will break. But you put the new wine into some new containers. And then he ends, "And no one who's ever tasted fine aged wine prefers the unaged wine." And what he's saying there is, once people taste the good things of God that I'm bringing, you won't want to go back to what you used to drink. So we're going to leave it there, and next time we'll plug into chapter 6 of the book of Luke. I hope this has been helpful. Please don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe, and maybe hit that notification bell. I will see you next time. Be well. Bye-bye.